This is James Peterson talking about historical ecology. Very excited to be here. My name is Carrie Winninger, and I'm the admitting people, sorry, I'm the host, and I am the outreach lead for the Center for Environmental Inquiry. And usually our public events are done at one of our preserves. So that's either Osborne Preserve on Sonoma Mountain in Pengrove, or our Galbraith Preserve near Yorkville in Mendocino. So while this shelter in place is happening, we are very happy to be able to welcome to the world of virtual events, and so happy you're along for the ride with us. So before I let James take it away, I just want to tell you a little about what this center is and does and how we can be a resource to you. No matter who you are, no matter if you're affiliated with SSU or not, whether you're a student, a parent, a government employee, nonprofit, educator, maybe you're just a member of the public, or you have an organization that's in need of environmental solutions. And that's what we try to do. So we're building this community of problem solvers and learners across all sectors of society, not just who you might traditionally think of as being involved with preserves or nature. And the way we want to do this is by providing firsthand experiences and understanding of our connection with the environment, and then skill building that results in sustainable solutions that we can all take part in. Now, we're talking about getting people aware, prepared, and engaged. So we want to teach you something, we want to motivate you, and we want to give you an opportunity and skills to actually go do something. So there's lots of ways that you can get engaged with us. You can engage in research. We have training programs that some of you have been involved in, like our naturalist programs and land management programs. If you're a student, we have jobs, internships for credit. You can attend events like these, or you can contribute or lead to events like these. You can access the data that comes from our projects, or you could work to partner with us on a project, or bring us an idea for a project or a solution that you need, and we can come up with a project about it. So there's all sorts of ways that we want to engage, and you, like all of you I see here, are important in addressing the greatest environmental challenges that humans have ever faced. Diversity is critical, and an engaged society is critical. So thank you all for being a part of the solution just by being here today. So this event has a pretty simple format. So the deep dive, this brings up a really good point. So what I'm gonna do first is mute everybody. And then I'm gonna make sure to unmute James. All right, James, can you test it and make sure I got you unmuted?
Can everyone hear me?
Perfect. All right. So James will spend about 45 minutes presenting. Then we'll have about 10 minutes for questions, and I'll make about a 2-minute wrap up. So right now you're all muted. Your video's on, and that's good, actually, because sometimes it's nice to have feedback, video feedback as James is presenting. But if you feel like turning it off, that's fine too. You have controls over that yourself. Now, if you do need to say something, I believe you can unmute yourself, but if that's not working, you can type to me in the chat box. And speaking of that, I'm gonna ask everyone to do me a favor right now. So normally we have a sign-in sheet that we pass around, but we can't do that. So if everyone could type your name, just your first and last name, into the Zoom chat box, that helps me match up who registered and who attended, because some people's Zoom usernames are not the same as their actual name. So if you could all just quickly type in your name, that would really help me. Now, if something is going on during the presentation technical, like you can't hear James, or like something's glitching, that's another place to use the chat box. I will be monitoring the chat box, so James will not. He'll be presenting, but I'll be monitoring it for that reason. Also, if you have any questions that pop up that you want to ask at the end, but you don't want to forget, feel free and type it in the chat box, and then I can say it out loud once we get to the question and answer session. Also, if you're just shy and don't want to say it out loud, type it in the chat box and I'll say it out loud. So I think that covers most of the stuff, and we kind of want to get going. So if anyone has any questions, go ahead and type it in. Otherwise, I am going to let James introduce himself, and I'm very excited to hear what he has to say.
Can everyone hear me? Awesome. Yeah, so thank you all for coming and listening today. My name is James Peterson. and I am a cultural resource management graduate student at Sonoma State. And my primary intellectual interest over the last 5 years has revolved around this question. How should we manage land in California that's not being managed for private financial gain? For example, this would be land that's owned by Sonoma County Parks or state parks or Marin County Parks and Open Space. In order to answer this question, I have studied and continue to study the history of California's land management in the American period, Native American land management in the late prehistoric period, environmental philosophy, and ecology in general. In particular, I'm also working on a very interesting history of Yosemite's 19th century land management, but I won't be talking about that today. I have come to a conclusion on how I think we should manage land in California, but I won't go into what I think we should do because we don't have enough time. I have lectured on this topic before for 3 hours, and I was just able to scratch the surface. I also don't want to quickly answer the question because despite seeming like a not so charged question at first glance, answering the question of how we should manage California's land is actually very controversial and full of emotion for a variety of reasons. Therefore, I don't even want to answer the question unless I can give a full answer. However, I will say that I believe that every plot of land should go through certain steps in order to determine their land management plan. Conducting a historical ecology report of the land in question is, I believe, one of those steps. Therefore, I believe that historical ecological reports are always highly practical and applicable to the land they are about. Today, I'm going to be lecturing about the historical ecology of the southern portion of the Fairfield-Osborne Preserve. And I believe it's important to know this information because I believe that it should be used to help determine how the Fairfield-Osborne Preserve should be managed today. Now, in case anyone doesn't know, the Fairfield-Osborne Preserve is an area of land owned by Sonoma State University on the western side of Sonoma Mountain, near the top of the mountain. Here is where the preserve is today. And can people see my mouse? Okay, so here's where the preserve is today. And now the question is, what is historical ecology? Historical ecology is, by definition, generally understood as a comprehensive, multidisciplinary field whose goal is to combine traditionally separated fields in search of reconstruction of past landscapes. In other words, the field seeks to answer what the environment in question used to look like and how it has changed over time. As part of my thesis, I have been conducting a historical ecology project of the southern part of the Fairfield-Osborne Preserve. And it's this part right here. And now I'm zoomed into that part. More specifically, I'm trying to understand what the Fairfield-Osborne Preserve used to look like at the end of the late prehistoric period and how it has changed over time. As well, for me, I'm interested in why it has changed over time. The data gathering part of my project is almost over, and as a result, I have some very interesting preliminary information to report. Some of it is a little rough as I haven't finished it all yet, so these numbers might change a little bit. However, before I begin to explain my work, I just want to state that there are lots of authors who have raised serious epistemological concerns with conducting any historical project. These concerns are about the ability of any one person to be able to tell histories that are true for everyone. In other words, is what I am about to say true for everyone? Had I been given the time, I could have addressed these epistemological concerns. However, I do not, and thus I will just proceed. But if you are interested in what these concerns are, some contemporary, academically popular authors who have raised these concerns are people like Bruno Latour, Sandra Harding, Ian Hodder, Tim Ingold, or Emma Waterton. With that, of course, the first question is, when did the late prehistoric period end? Unfortunately, any answer to this question is also bound to be controversial. However, it's likely that this period ended at the Fairfield Osborne Preserve around 1820, and this is the date that I will use. Here is a quick history lesson to help contextualize that date and give you a brief refresher on California history. In 1769, Junipero Serra and Gaspar de Portola crossed what is now the US-Mexico border to start the mission system and established what is now called California as part of Spain. In 1775, the first European ship sailed into the Bay Area. The ship was an exploratory ship called the San Carlos. The Franciscan priest on board was a man named Vicente Santa Maria, and in his journal, as the ship was leaving the Bay Area, just after a month sailing around the North Bay and peacefully meeting with members of the various local Native American tribes, wrote, quote, "What is certain is that they themselves seem to be asking at a start at entering within the fold of our Catholic religion. Not to avail them of this opportunity would be a lamentable misfortune." 1 year later, in 1776, Mission Dolores in San Francisco was established. The same year, the Declaration of Independence was signed in Philadelphia. Mission Dolores was followed by Mission San Rafael in 1817, and finally, the last mission, Mission Sonoma, was established in 1823. I think I might have said 1917, but I meant 1817. Due to Spanish colonialism heading north at this time, the late prehistoric period likely ended at the Fairfield Osborne Preserve around 1820. To backtrack to 1910, taking advantage of Napoleon's wars, Mexico declared its independence from Spain in 1810 and fought a war for independence until 1821, when it eventually won. Mission San Rafael was established during this war, and this makes the Sonoma mission the only mission established after the Spanish period and during the Mexican period. From 1821 to 1846, California, mainly along the coast ranges up to Sonoma County, was under Mexican rule. Under this rule, the mission system was slowly disbanded and replaced with the ranchero system, where the land under Mexican rule was primarily owned by a few individuals who owned vast estates, upward of 60,000 acres. Perhaps General Vallejo is the most famous of those individuals. However, in 1846, California became a territory of the United States through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and after a long series of events through the Compromise of 1850, California became a state in the US. So with that, here again is the satellite image of the southern portion of the preserve as it stands today. Today, this area of the preserve is predominantly bay forests, live oak forests, valley oak forests, and a conifer forest. California bay forests occupy 29.5% of the preserve today in this southern portion. Conifer forests occupy 4% of this southern portion. Coastal live oak forests occupy 28.2% of the southern portion of the preserve today. And valley oak forests occupy 19.3% of the southern portion of the preserve. Excluding the valley oak forests, 61% of the preserve in this southern portion is composed of either bay, live oak, or conifer forests. Generally, this means that there is a lot of bay, live oak, and conifer throughout the southern portion of this preserve. Now, if you include the valley oak forest and the miscellaneous forest types I didn't mention that take up only 2% of the preserve today, they all together compose 83% of the southern portion of the preserve. And that's all of the forests. Now, these forest types are all very dense. In fact, based on one sample area, there's around 400 to 420 trees per every 2.8 acres. However, I am more technically defining a dense forest as meaning that from above, 80% or more of the Earth's floor is blocked by the foliage of the trees. This is a dense forest. Since the forests are all dense, this means that 83% of the southern portion of the Fairfield-Osborn Preserve is composed of forest types that take up 80% or more of the Earth's surface with their foliage from above. This density is causing the trees within those forests to display a closed canopy morphology. And thus these forests are, as I like to say, toothpick forests. And here's an example of a bay toothpick forest. These trees are around 40 feet tall with only 10-foot canopies. A tree that has a closed canopy morphology is a tree that is tall, straight, and vertical. More technically, it is taller than it is wide. When there are lots of these trees together, they all look like bundles of toothpicks. This morphology happens because the trees spend most of their energy growing up as a result of the density of growth around them. Here is another example of a valley oak toothpick forest from the preserve. Then finally, we have the grasslands. They compose 11.8% of the preserve today in the southern portion. Oh, go back. This all means that most of the preserve today is a dense forest with the average tree having a closed canopy morphology as a result of growing up in this dense forest. As well, the most common two trees are bay and then live oak. Now, the Fairfield-Osborn Preserve has actually had decreasing land management pressure since the 1880s for a variety of reasons. Therefore, this preserve, as a result of this decreasing land management pressure, should be returning the preserve to what it looked like in the late prehistoric period, if this land wasn't under any sort of Native American land management. However, my investigation into the Fairfield-Osborn Preserve has concluded that, as a result of this more hands-off land management, the land in the southern portion of the preserve is actually heading away from what the preserve looked like in 1820. Despite seeming impossible when looking at the preserve today, my work has concluded that this southern portion of the preserve in 1820 likely had no dense bay, conifer, live oak, or valley oak forests. In fact, the preserve was likely 100% a very well-spaced black, valley, and live oak savanna. This means that in 1820, the preserve was likely a very open scattering of oak trees, with the average tree having an open canopy morphology as a result of growing up in an open savanna. As well, the two most common trees were likely black and valley oak. It was not predominantly a dense forest with bay and live oak dominating. To be more precise, my work has concluded that the savanna averaged one tree per 3.44 acres. This seems like a lot, but what that means is that each tree likely had a 218-foot radius around it, where there weren't any other trees. And this is the tree. Since the southern portion of the preserve is 141 acres, this means that there was likely only 41 trees growing in the southern portion. Of these 41 trees, 45% were likely black oak, 33% were likely valley oak, and 17% were likely live oak. 2.5% were likely maple. This means that there was likely only 19 black oaks, 14 valley oaks, 7 coastal live oaks, and 1 maple. Due to this spacing, it's likely that all of these oak trees displayed what I call the open canopy morphology. This is the opposite of the closed canopy morphology. These trees are short with a high girth and are very horizontal. Technically, these are trees that are more horizontal than vertical. This happens with oaks because of the lack of competition for sun. In other words, oak trees seem to prefer to grow horizontal if they're given the option to. I have surveyed the southern portion of the preserve, looking for any trees that started growing before 1820. I have found a few, and they all display this open growth form, except one that is growing on the edge of a cliff, and it's equally horizontal as it is tall. I have 3 examples of these trees. Here is one example. Here is another example. And here's the last example. As you can see with these trees, they have a lot of horizontal growth, and they don't grow that tall. They're predominantly wide versus vertical. And as you can see, this tree in particular is having major lateral branching only about 4 feet off the ground. And let's look at this tree a little bit more closely. It's about 30 feet tall, and it's about 80 feet wide. And thus it has approximately a 40-foot radius from trunk to tree line, or to drip line. This means that the average gap between the trees in 1820, if you go by the canopy line, not the trunk, likely averaged around 180 feet. Therefore, the average tree back in 1820 was either a black oak or a valley oak that had this open canopy structure. And which means it was likely a very iconically California oak savanna. Now, this makes sense because in 1880, according to the US Census taker, the first American owner of this southern portion of the preserve was a man named John Russell. Of this southern portion, he had 87 acres of this land in till, with 73 acres of it as permanent meadow. Of the 87 acres in till, he was growing 15 acres of hay, 60 acres of barley, and 12 acres of wheat. The 73 acres of permanent meadow were used for his 7 horses, 12 milk cows, 8 male cows, 14 pigs, and 40 chickens. Since the land was so open, Russell was able to quickly establish this much tillage, and also, given that openness, it would make sense that the census taker would describe the rest of that land as permanent meadow. As well, it also makes sense why the census taker would write that John Russell had 0 acres of woodlot on his property in 1880, and that he was cutting down no trees for sale as firewood or lumber. To quickly look at the grasslands, assuming this uniform display of trees with 80-foot circular canopies and excluding the riparian areas, around 79% of the preserve was grassland between these scattered trees. Now, where did this information come from? I don't have too much time to explain my sources, but the core of this information came from 2 land surveys done by the General Land Office. One was done in 1853 and one in 1865. As an example of the power of this information, in 1865, a surveyor recorded that this spot within this circle had no trees within it. And as today, as I mentioned earlier, this spot now has, assuming PG&E didn't cut down recently all of these trees, because these are power lines right here, there would be approximately 400 to 420 trees in this circle. But in 1865, there were no trees in this circle. And this is the corner of the southern portion of the preserve. As well, this line right here, which is the eastern edge of the southern portion of the preserve, was described as a, quote, scattering of white, black, and live oak. But today I would describe this area as a dense bay live oak forest, which is right here. I'm talking about this line. As well, I used a map made by General Vallejo in 1852 that documents the vegetation at the Fairfield Osborne Preserve at that time. In 1850, General Vallejo tried to claim that Mexico had given him essentially all of the Sonoma Mountain Range, and this included the Fairfield Osborne Preserve. Here is the Fairfield Osborne Preserve on that map that General Vallejo made in 1852, which he submitted to the state of California to try to gain ownership of the Sonoma Mountain Range. So this was an official map that he submitted. And the circle is where I estimate Fairfield Osborne Preserve is today on that map. And this creek right here is likely Copeland Creek. And what I want you to notice is just how sparse the trees are. As well, if I had the full map in view, there's conifer trees drawn on the very eastern side of the map, but here there are only trees that are drawn with circles. And I suspect that the trees with circles are oak trees, because the trees that are conifer are grown like classic Christmas trees. And so now let's compare and contrast 1820 to 2020 in more detail. Over the last 200 years, there has been an almost complete loss of this original Black Valley and live oak savanna with its open canopy growth and widely spaced trees and rolling grasslands. It has been replaced by 117 acres of dense forest with closed canopy trees that are mainly bay and live oak. To break this down, in 1820, there was likely 0 acres of dense forest, and now there is 117 acres. This is an 83% increase in 200 years. This means that there's just physically way more trees on the preserve today than there was in 1820. As a rough estimate, there are probably around 16,560 trees growing in the southern part of the preserve today, as compared to just 41 in 1820. This is a 403% increase in the amount of trees growing. When analyzing this 117 acres of dense forest growth, we see that the southern part of the preserve has experienced a 29.5% increase in bay forest, a 4% increase in conifer forest, a 28.2% increase in live oak forest, and a 19.3% increase in valley oak forest. This means that the preserve went from 0 acres of bay forest to 41 acres, from 0 acres of conifer to 5.6 acres of conifer, from 0 acres of live oak forest to 39.8 acres of live oak forest, from 0 acres of valley oak forest to 27.2 acres of valley oak forest. This means that there has been a change in the ratio of how much each oak is present on the preserve when compared to the other oaks. Live oak was the least common oak in 1820, and now it's the most common oak. Valley oak is still the second most common oak. Black oak was the most common oak, and now it's the least common oak, and is mainly just scattered among the oak forests today. When we step back and look at all of the trees, we see that in 1820, the most common trees were black, valley, and live oak. In 2020, the most common trees are bay, live oak, valley oak, conifer, and black oak. Therefore, we see that black oak went from number 1 to number 5. Bay went from not present to number 1. Live oak was number 3 and is now number 2. And finally, valley oak went from number 2 to number 3. And perhaps the most important change, though, is the fall of black oak from 1 to 5, and the rise of bay from non-existent to number 1. Now, because of the density of this growth, these trees are now also growing with closed canopy morphologies, as opposed to their original open savanna, open canopy growth. With the grasses, as these dense forests have been increasing, there has been a 67.2% decrease in grasslands since 1820. In 1820, there was likely around 111 acres of grassland, and now there is 16.6 acres. Therefore, in sum, to say it again, this black valley and live oak savanna, with its open canopy growth and widely spaced trees and rolling grasslands, has been replaced by 117 acres of dense forest with closed canopy trees that are mainly bay and live oaks. Now the land has had decreasing land management pressure since the 1880s. General Vallejo and John Russell were managing the land throughout the mid-1800s. General Vallejo was running cattle for the hide and tallow trade, likely since around the 1830s. Vallejo lost this land by the 1850s, but probably continued running cattle until the early 1860s, as there would have been really no one to tell him not to. Russell then was likely engaging in agricultural activities since the early 1860s. In 1880, the land likely was at the peak of its agricultural intensity, of its land management intensity. By 1942, the amount of land under tillage at Fairfield Osborne had decreased substantially. In 1880, there were 87 acres of land in till, but by 1942, only 8.5 acres of tilled agriculture remained. And this is the 1942 aerial image of the preserve, the southern portion of the preserve. Did I say 1842? I meant 1942. Image, and here is the areas that are under till in 1942. And that's, sorry about the text on the image, but this shows, you can kind of see it without the vector layer there. In the 1950s or 60s, the Roths acquired the land, and the land was run as essentially their private retreat. And then the Nature Conservancy acquired the land, and then finally Sonoma State. During this time, there was also very little land management pressure on the land. Now, since the land has had decreasing land management pressure since the 1880s, the preserve can be thought of as becoming more and more natural. Therefore, the preserve today is very natural. What can be learned from this is that the natural state of the Fairfield Osborne Preserve could be thought of as successive vegetation alliances leading to a temporary climax community. The succession is from grasslands to shrublands, then to a dense conifer alliance or a dense bay live oak alliance. This would then eventually, occurring less often than once every 150 years, burn down from a lightning strike, with that disturbance being possibly what restarts the process or just causes mass crown sprouting, resulting in the same conifer or bay live oak alliance. However, in this successional pattern, we never get black valley and live oak savanna with that spacing and those qualities. This means that the preserve in the southern part at the end of the late prehistoric period was highly unnatural. Therefore, there was likely extensive Native American land management happening at the preserve in the late prehistoric period. And that's the end. I feel it was a little shorter than I thought it would be, but I was very concerned about running out of time.
That was great, James. No, I like it because now we have like 15 minutes for questions, and I'm sure people have thoughts about this. So with that, I have questions myself, but I first want to open it up to everybody else. So if anyone has a question, you can either type it in the chat box or you can just unmute yourself and start talking. And in fact, I think what I'm going to do is unmute everybody because you might have to get permission to do so. So if you need to, then go back and mute yourself again. So here's unmuting everybody. And if you have noise in the background, if you could please then mute yourself.
Yeah, and if anyone wants me to go over any numbers or anything again,
I do have a few questions people are typing in the chat box that I can say out loud to you, James.
Yeah, please do.
So first off is, what type of land management did the Native Americans practice?
Well, that's a complicated question. Well, I guess I can say some general comments. There is evidence that in my research I found that the surveyors in 1853 were finding were described the land as covered with burnt granite rock. So there was likely burning happening, prescribed fires happening. And in terms of what exactly happened there, it's very hard to say specifically. And I think probably it's probably best to let the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria answer that question more specifically.
There is a follow-up question here that you may or may not be able to answer. Did Native Americans preferentially manage for black oaks due to acorn quality or other desirable aspects?
Yeah, I think that once again, probably I shouldn't speak on behalf of any Native American tribe, so I should probably let Federated Indians of Great Rancheria answer that question. So
I think what that person is getting at is maybe that huge difference in black oak composition, and maybe anything you have to say about why that, causes of that, possibly.
Say that, why what?
Just about, I think they just might be remarking on that huge change in black oak
absolutely.
Composition.
Yeah, I think that's one of the, it's a very substantial change. I think that you could safely generally say that it does, just from this presentation, it does seem to suggest that black oaks aren't, well, let me rephrase that. I think you can pretty strongly say that, based on the work that I've done, that large open canopy black oaks that don't have any trees around them and that are growing in that savanna aren't natural, in the sense that the preserve doesn't want to, when it's left to its own devices, or when it's the natural processes are themselves let to unfold as they will without any human interference, it doesn't produce those types of black oaks. So it's likely that there was a particular reason for, it's likely that there was anthropogenic or human land management causing those trees to be there for a particular reason. And what those reasons were are not something that I can particularly answer, but it does, the evidence suggests that they weren't there naturally.
And that leads to another couple questions. Somebody asks, what has been the role of plant diseases in shaping the preserve the last 150 years? And that kind of ties into things I've been wondering about, the term natural, and also human influence, and how it can be direct or it can be indirect, and how human influence in 1820 is very different than how human influence might be now. And so like plant diseases, like this person is asking, because I study sudden oak death, I know that is actually because of human global trade, even though it's a plant disease. So it's like all that interplay.
Yeah.
So anyway, the question was about how plant diseases might have shaped the preserve over the last 150 years.
Well, I think that, I will say that likely as a consequence of the increasing density of vegetation as a result of the absence of anthropogenic involvement with the land since 1880 has favored certain diseases and has favored certain microbiology and disfavored or worked against other microbiology. So perhaps, for instance, if we're dealing with Phytophthora ramorum, which is sudden oak death, that the environment at the Fairfield Osborne Preserve would be an ideal environment for Phytophthora, because it's dense and it's going to hold a lot of moisture as a result of not having sun penetration into the soils. So Phytophthora being a water mold likely is going to benefit from that type of management, and thus probably be much more successful than it would, say, in a very open savanna where there's not a lot of tree contact and there's a lot of sun just constantly hitting the ground, which would cause low levels of water and like very quick evaporation. So I think that the effects of the microbiology have likely been generally following the consequences of these larger land management shifts, and accelerating them and pushing them in different directions.
Interesting. So the question was like how the disease affects the preserve, but you think the structure affects the disease, and it's all connected.
I don't believe that Phytophthora ramorum is the reason the preserve looks the way it looks today. There doesn't seem to be enough, I don't think that the Phytophthora is enough itself to say, oh, this preserve would be a very open black and valley oak savanna if Phytophthora wasn't there. I think that the bays and the conifers and the live oaks are growing on their own volition, and they negatively, and for instance, say let's just say like with bays, they're going to be growing on their own volition, and since they're a classic and infamous carrier and spreader of sudden oak death, they'll be amplifying the intensity of sudden oak death. So they also might be discouraging valley and black oak from growing by themselves carrying the disease. So it could be like they could be symbiotically accelerating the decreasing amount of black oaks on the preserve.
I have so much. Maybe you and I can just connect later because that's so fascinating. But there's other questions that are about other things, so I want to get to those. So one person wants just to understand the difference between Black Valley and live oak.
Yeah, that black oak is the oak tree that well, they all produce acorns, and black oak is the one with really big leaves that has spikes on the end. I don't know for sure, but it's generally considered one of the biggest leafing oaks in California. Valley oak is the one that's lobed, has lobed edges. It's the kind of a very iconic California tree. It's usually really big. And then coastal live oak is the one that has the oak leaves that are like little cups, and they're concave and that they curve up and they have spikes along the edges, and they like the name implies occur predominantly in the coastal mountain region of California. So yeah, that's the.
And I guess one difference also is deciduous versus evergreen quality.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. Is that coastal live oak is evergreen, so it holds its leaves all year, and black and valley oak are deciduous, meaning that in the winter they won't have leaves. So when you walk around a valley and black oak forest in December, there won't be any foliage. So that's one really easy way to distinguish at least those two from coastal live oak.
Is there any quality difference in acorns? Do you know of?
Well, I think that, once again, that's a question that the Federated Indians of Great Rancheria can speak to, because it's about really your intent, like what do you want to do with them. But generally, as a rule of thumb, according to this U.S. Forest Service document that MCAT Anderson produced, black oak generally, as a rule of thumb, is a highly valued tree for Native Americans.
Mm-hmm. And then just a quick note so we don't think that sudden oak death was on the preserve before the 1980s, but coast live oak and black oak can both be infected. Valley oak cannot. So there's another difference. Another question, is there evidence that we have a wider diversity of flora and fauna on the preserve today? Or did the past have a wider variety? Wildflowers, animals.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's always like, how do you even talk about biodiversity? I think that it's really interesting to say. It's likely. Was there just literally a greater degree? Was there just more species, not in terms of quantity of species, but the actual was there just more distinct species present in 1820 than today? That is, it's hard to say. I will say that it's likely. There's a great environmental historian who wrote a book called California's Fading Wildflowers. I believe that's the name. Who argued that there was way more forbs, which are flowers, than there in 1820 than there are today. So what we're calling grasslands were likely, and there's some other archaeological work, which it's kind of like called eco-archaeology, looking at or paleo, or no, not paleo, just eco-archaeology, looking at plant remains to try to see what the composition was of grasslands. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests the grasslands in the late prehistoric period were much richer in flowers than they are today. And it generally, if I'm remembering this right, the further inland you are from the coast, the more generally there were flowers compared to grasses, if I'm remembering that right. And grasses were predominantly on the coast, and flowers got more grew in greater concentrations and went inland. So the Fairfield Osborne Preserve likely had much more forbs than it does today. And there was, so of the grasslands, that was probably a more diverse situation, and the forbs were probably in a much greater quantity than they are now. But again, it, like, in terms of the trees, there were much less trees there in 1820 than now. So for instance, like bay wasn't probably likely in the preserve in the concentration that it is today. So like in some sense, like you could look at that as it's getting more diverse. Like there's more bay, but there's also, so it's a difficult, I guess what I'm saying is it's a difficult question to answer, but I would say, how about this? To end the question will be that I think the grasslands are probably likely less diverse than they were, and the forests can be rather uniform, especially when they get dense like this. So there's probably low levels of biodiversity in there compared to, like, I think if you just aggregate the whole, there were probably more it's so hard to say. There was probably a greater, I don't know.
Well, it kind of makes sense, right, with the grasslands, because right now we have very little native grassland left. And as Suzanne DeCourcy, our preserve education manager, always talks about, she loves grasslands, you know, with native grasslands, mostly bunch grasses, there's all that space in the corners for all the forbs to thrive.
Exactly.
Which doesn't exist with the invasive annuals.
Yeah. And there was probably, yeah, absolutely. And like, if, you know, it's likely that the land management strategies that the Native American communities on this preserve would have been using would have been encouraging forbs. So.
Well, somebody has a related question. Is bay considered invasive, and how did it get here?
Well, this is also a classic question. I mean, we're kind of starting to really get into the serious questions about what's native, what's invasive, what does biodiversity even mean? Do we want biodiversity? Is that something that as a land manager, you should just strive for? Absolutely. And it's such an interesting question, what plants are native and what plants aren't. I mean, I think if you it depends on really what you mean by native, but I feel like, so if native means there in the end of the late prehistoric period, then perhaps it's likely not native. But is that even the right criteria that we should go by to define native and not native? And if you zoom out, there was lots of bay on the Sonoma Mountain Range. I mean, the surveyors are finding and using bay laurel on the Sonoma Mountain Range. So if you zoom out, and then you could say, oh, there was bay in the Sonoma Mountain Range. So it also depends on how general and specific you want to be.
And maybe the answer to how it got there is it was growing nearby, just not directly on the preserve.
Yeah, and it is likely that that's probably the reason why it started growing there. Is it just without management working against bay, it will just grow on its own accord, vis-a-vis sort of a natural spreading of the seed.
So we do have more questions, and James has offered to stay longer. So please feel free and stay if you can. But I know some people have to take off, and we only have 2 minutes. So I just want to give a couple words about what else is coming up with the center, and then we'll get right back to the questions and answers. So I just want to mention that this is only one of literally dozens of virtual events this spring. We've really got a lot of things put together, and they're quite diverse. So we're trying to get them through at least the beginning of June. So I encourage everybody to go look at the center calendar. And that website, if you don't have it, is cei.sonoma.edu/calendar. And you do need to pre-register for events in order to get the link for Zoom. So feel free to spread the word, even for people who don't live around the North Bay, because everybody can attend. It's virtual. Some specific events coming up that I want to highlight that might be of interest to this particular crowd are 2 days from now is an event called Learn with a Naturalist, Our Connection to Sonoma Mountain. And that's going to be pretty different from this one. It's both in form and content, going to be much more like imagining yourself bringing a cup of tea to join an SSU naturalist and hear her story, both on how she has been connected to nature throughout her life and her experience as part of our programs, and now what Sonoma Mountain means to her. So that one is just going to be a fun time to get together. Then on Friday this week is a really exciting citizen science event that is also kind of a deep dive. So this is by our nature tech coordinator, Dr. Chris Hawley. Very excited. This is his first time leading a public event for us. And it's called Climate Change and Personal Action, which is very appropriate for Earth Week timing. So it's about how you can do things to help the Earth just on your own. So it's really a fun one to do. And it uses an app on your phone called I See Change that you can help track climate change through a variety of different ways. And then this weekend coming up is the Sudden Oak Death Blitz. And that's in partnership with University of California Cooperative Extension. And it takes place every year in a public meeting format, and we've adapted it to be virtual. So there's training online. You can come pick up packets with a very secure, safe for COVID-19 situation at the UCCE office in Santa Rosa for a 2-hour window on Saturday or a 2-hour window on Sunday. We were mailing packets to people, but that window has closed. So now you would need to come pick them up. And you can read all about how the safety measures are put in place, how you can collect leaves, and then those are going to be able to be returned to UC Berkeley for free because we're providing postage paid, pre-addressed envelopes. So it's a really great way of getting your tan oak or California Bay laurel trees tested for sudden oak death for free. And it literally only happens once a year. So this is the time to do that if you want them done. And all of that information is on the website. And there's plenty of more after that too. So go ahead and take a look at those. Stay safe. We hope to see you soon. And now let's get back to some questions.
And I just will say that part of one of the interesting questions that come up when thinking about what should we do, how should we manage Fairfield Osborne Preserve? It's, for instance, in a lot of ways, Fairfield Osborne Preserve has been acting as a major carbon sink. This growth has been sucking up carbon like crazy. So to go back to 1820, say if that was what you wanted to do, you'd be releasing lots and lots of carbon because you have to be getting rid of all these trees. So in a way, it's been acting like a carbon sink. But on the flip side, it's potentially a lot more fire risk because the high density of these trees. Mm-hmm. So you can end up with competing interests like that. Do we want to have a carbon sink, or do we want to have it be more fire safe, or do we want to go back to or do we just want to go back to what it was, or do we want to continue what we're doing? So you can see how these interesting questions evolve. But I'll get back to the questions.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's there's a lot of different questions. So one person's asking about if you have any idea, how has the land changed over the last 50,000 years?
Oh, I mean, I almost have nothing to say about that, except that I know it's been pretty substantial, and that it was, I think, at one point underwater, or there was a river. That would be more of a question, I think, for like a geologist to get into geologic time like that. I mean, I know the mountain ranges are relatively new in terms of geologic time. So I know there's a lot of good work on that, and someone like a professor at Sonoma State who would know a lot about that is a professor named Michelle Goman, and she I went on a walk around the preserve with her, and she was going into details like that. But needless to say, I can say that it was pretty different.
All right. Have you seen evidence for a changing hydrology in regards to Copeland Creek from oak savanna to dense canopy forest?
Well, that would be really, that would be a really interesting thing. Like if you're thinking of the sense that like there's been less water, like say, okay, like if you're thinking that there's less water getting down to the valley because the tree roots are absorbing a lot of the water. But on the flip side, there's less evaporation likely because there's a higher density of trees. So the water temperature has probably gone down. That's maybe one way to think about it. But in terms of, that would be a really interesting project. It would be pretty extensive. I mean, they used to call, Copeland Creek did not, as you would imagine, wasn't always called that. And on one of General Vallejo's map, it was called, I think it was called Crane Mill Creek. Or no, I don't think that was right actually, but I think it was called not Crane, but there was a mill creek involved. So it was likely that they were using it as a mill, like mill water. So one of the interesting ways you could go about that was to try to, if you could find some sort of records about water flow that they were, when can they operate this equipment using this as a mill? This creek is for milling or whatever, to try to get some measurements on the water flow.
It's so fascinating when your research just creates more questions of other possible research.
Oh yeah, there's tons. So in terms of like, and has like the river course changed? Yeah, it definitely has changed. Definitely once you get towards the valley. But in terms of it's like what it is in the mountains, I also don't really know. But it's likely that it's probably, at least in the Fairfield Osborne Preserve, hasn't changed. Its course probably hasn't changed. So yeah, but there are major water features that were not there. There's two lakes that were not there in 1820. Both of them were created by dams. And there's a freshwater marsh that's a perennial spring that was there, and whether the marsh or not has been there the whole time is hard to say.
Interesting. So the two lakes you're talking about are what we now call Turtle Pond and Kelly Pond?
Yeah, exactly. And those two are created in the American period, and they are both made by dams. And if you look with the right eyes, you can pretty clearly see the dams.
And do you think that those have changed because the fact that those were created has changed the hydrology or vegetation in any meaningful way?
Well, that's another really good point. I mean, that's probably added biodiversity. I mean, there's lots of different, for instance, those ponds have lots of different species as a result of being, like, they have species associated with freshwater marshes that were not likely there in 1820. So for instance, there was probably no tule growing, or maybe there was, but maybe in that freshwater marsh from the perennial spring there might have been. But those would be really interesting questions. Like there's probably a greater diversity of freshwater marsh species today than there was in 1820. So for instance, if you were saying that we should go back to 1820, you would need to get rid of those water features, but you would be losing that biodiversity of those species. The turtles and stuff that live in those ponds would be impacted. So you can see how there's interesting competing biodiverse questions. So in that regard, in terms of freshwater marshes, the preserve is likely more biodiverse today than it was in 1820.
Another question is, it seems better now because there's more trees, right? But is the total mass about the same?
No, I bet a 40-inch black oak tree that is probably extremely heavy, that's 80 feet wide in canopy, and 30 feet tall. But there's no way that 41 trees on average, as kind of a statistical average, are heavier or the same than about 16,000 skinny trees. I've thought about that, like in terms of the total weight of the preserve on the mountain, it's probably much heavier today than it was back then.
Somebody just has a comment saying that they highly recommend Rebecca Solnit's books, Savage Dreams and Yosemite in Time, both discussing Yosemite historically and regarding indigenous communities, if you don't know them already.
Yeah, that's a kind of a slightly. I'm aware of those work and I'm aware of that work, but it's a slightly different topic than what we're getting at with the Fairfield Osborne Preserve. But yes, thank you for reminding
and
me.
that leads into another question, which are these changes that you're talking about unique to Osborne Preserve, or could they represent most of Sonoma County?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question as well. I think generally it's so hard to make these large projections, which is why historical ecology is so important to do on a land by land basis. It's very hard to make general comments. But given that, I'll make a general comment. And I think that likely for these similar ecological conditions, it's likely that the same is true. The same historical situation has developed. Like what I mean is areas that are in the coastal mountain range that are managed, that have been sort of bound up in low management pressure situations are likely experiencing the same ecological shifts. For instance, like if you now are running a organic, kale farm in the valley, that has had a totally different historical trajectory. But in terms of land bound up in these land management situations that are like in low pressure management situations for non-financial reasons, like Marin County Parks, Sonoma County Parks, and in similar ecological ranges like mountains in the coastal mountain range, it's probably very similar.
Well, the last question seems to be for me. Is there a place on the center website that lists all of the research that has been and is being done on the preserve? So my answer to that is kind of. So we actually started this website that we have now less than a year ago. So a lot of it is available, but we are still adding things. So I don't want to say that all is there, but a good amount is. So how you would access that, we think we've done a pretty good job with navigation. So you can find everything about the center, the preserves, all at cei.sonoma.edu. If you want to specifically access data, most of which was from a project, then you just add /data. And then you'll be able to click on tabs like weather, geology and soils, species lists, cultural resources, maps and spatial data, imagery, publications and reports, land management, all sorts of different data that you can use. You can also, instead of going to cei.sonoma.edu/data, go to /projects. And that is a space for projects and funding that maybe doesn't have data yet. So you can search for projects. And if you click on that button, it'll show you a place where you can type in what you're looking for. It could be at a specific location, a particular project topic, or tags. And it also allows you to just scroll through a list and look at some that are current or past, some projects, and who the faculty is and who the partners are. So those are two different ways to look at what's going on research-wise at the preserves and with the center in general. So that is the last chat question, and we are 13 minutes over. People were very excited about your talk, James. Is there anything else you want to say before we wrap up, or any other questions anyone has? Now's the time.
Yeah, I guess I'll just say as a general comment that I hope this talk has helped people see that there are very serious land management decisions and there are very serious, I guess what I'm saying is that coming up with land management plans is a complicated process in there, it really isn't always an easy answer.
Mm-hmm.
And that I think historical ecology helps reveal how complicated and hard that can be.
One person did have another question when I said that. What do you plan on doing with this study?
Well, I'm hoping that this will help. Well, I guess in particular at the Fairfield Osborne, I hope that this report somehow ends up helping with land management decisions in the future. And for me personally, I'm just helping. It's just helping. It's a part of a master's thesis. But in terms of it being used for the preserve, I hope that it is able to be used to help develop land management plans for the preserve.
Well, everyone, thank you so much for coming. And James, such a big round of applause. I feel like this work is something that really kind of shifts perspective on what is native and what is natural and what are we trying to restore and conserve and why. And
Yep.
it's really fascinating stuff. Like I'm gonna think about this more for my work too. So
Yeah, there was just one last comment in terms of that restoring. You know what? This cut right here was done by PG&E, and I was on the preserve with another historical ecologist named Arthur Dawson, who people might know in this talk. And we were joking that in a way, PG&E has been doing a land restoration project, even though they didn't know it, because they've been cutting the trees from this area, which would have been more historically accurate.
wow. Yep. It's important to think about all of that, and the historical context is just such an important piece that we're so thankful for. So with that, I'm going to invite everybody to reach out to me or James with any other questions or follow-up. I did send that email yesterday with his email shown. So he is the person that you can see his email address if you need to get to him. And other than that, thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you at other events soon. What was that, James? Go ahead.
Yeah, and just feel free to reach out and get in contact with me with any questions you might have regarding this sort of stuff.
Great. Thank you so much, and everybody have a fantastic week.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you,
James. Thank you, Carrie.